There are moments in history when a single act of courage becomes more than just a mission. It becomes a movement, a moment that breaks silence, challenges fear, and rewrites the story of a people. And in the heart of West Africa, such a moment has arrived. The world now calls it the 90-kilometer rescue. But to millions across the continent, it is something far greater. It is the sound of Africa rising. It is the voice of a new generation saying, "We no longer wait for rescue. We are the rescue." And leading this awakening is a man whose name has become a symbol of courage, defiance, and rebirth. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. In the golden dust of the Sahel, where the sun burns with merciless fire and the wind carries the whispers of forgotten wars, a quiet revolution was unfolding. Burkina Faso, once known as Upper Volta, has seen empires rise and fall. Colonizers come and go, leaders promise and fail. But never before had it seen a leader quite like this one. Young, fearless, and unapologetically African. In October 2022, the world watched in disbelief as a 34-year-old army captain took control of his nation, not through greed but through conviction. He declared one message that echoed far beyond his borders. Africa will stand tall again. Burkina Faso will be free again. To many outsiders, it was just another military change. But to Africans, it was something different. It was the sound of chains beginning to crack. For years, Burkina Faso has suffered one of the most violent insurgencies on the continent. Villages burned, families displaced, children orphaned. The northern provinces became war zones, controlled not by government, but by armed groups that spread terror in the name of ideology and power. Entire communities were cut off. No food, no medicine, no help. International organizations called for aid. Foreign powers made speeches. But in reality, the people were alone. Until one day the call came. A simple but powerful order from the young captain himself. A mission that would stretch 90 kilometers into hostile territory. A mission that no one believed could succeed. The plan was daring. Thousands of people had been trapped in towns like Djibo and Arbinda, surrounded by militants, starving for months. Humanitarian convoys couldn't reach them. Even the United Nations warned that a rescue would be nearly impossible. But Captain Traoré refused to accept that. He gathered his commanders and said words that would become legend. If we cannot feed our people, we do not deserve to lead them. If we cannot walk 90 kilometers to reach them, then who are we leading? And so it began. The march through fire and dust. No foreign air support. No NATO planes. Just Burkinabe soldiers carrying rifles, rations, and relentless faith. They called it Operation 90 km. But for those who took part, it was more than an operation. It was a pilgrimage. From fear to freedom. The soldiers set out under the blazing sun. Day 1, 30 kilometers through dry land and ambush zones. Day 2, heavy fighting in the savannah. Day 3, exhaustion, hunger, and the echoes of gunfire. But they did not stop, because ahead of them were their brothers, their sisters, their people, waiting, starving, praying. And when they finally reached the trapped civilians, something powerful happened. Tears replaced fear, songs replaced silence. And for the first time in months, the flag of Burkina Faso flew free in a land once lost. The 90-kilometer rescue wasn't just a victory on the battlefield. It was a spiritual victory. It told every African watching, we do not need to wait for others to save us. We can save ourselves. And that message began to spread. Across Mali, Niger, Ghana, Chad, the Congo, a ripple of hope carried by the winds of a continent tired of waiting. They called Ibrahim Traoré the son of Sankara, because like the legendary Thomas Sankara before him, he speaks of dignity, pride, and self-reliance. He reminds his people that freedom without food is hollow, and independence without unity is weak. He speaks the language of the street, not of the elite. He talks not of dependency, but of destiny. And the people listen. He says, we will not beg. We will build. We will not kneel. We will stand. We will not wait for rescue. Because Africa is the rescue. In every great story, there comes a turning point, a moment when the hero faces not the enemy outside, but the doubt within. For Burkina Faso, that moment came after the rescue, because even after victory, the road ahead remained long. Terrorist attacks continued, supplies remained scarce. Foreign media called him authoritarian, but Traoré didn't flinch. He went to the front lines himself, walking shoulder to shoulder with his soldiers. He ate what they ate. He slept where they slept. He showed a kind of leadership that Africa had not seen in decades. A leader who fights with his people, not from behind them. And across the continent, something stirred. In Mali, young people shouted his name. In Niger, crowds carried his image. In Senegal, in Guinea, in Congo, posters appeared reading, "Be your own rescue." The movement was no longer just about one man. It had become an idea. An idea that fear is the greatest weapon ever used against Africa, and courage, the only cure. Traoré once said in a speech, "Liberation begins when fear ends." And that is the heart of the 90-kilometer story. Because liberation isn't only about guns and borders. It's about the mind. It's about believing that you are worthy of freedom. For too long, Africa was told it was weak, that it needed saving, that it couldn't survive without loans, aid, or lectures. But the 90-kilometer march proved otherwise. It showed that the true strength of Africa lies not in its minerals, not in its money, but in its people. Today, the story of that rescue echoes beyond Burkina Faso. It has become a rallying cry for a continent reclaiming its identity. Across African social media, the youth share one phrase: "Africa no longer waits for rescue. Africa is the rescue." That's not just a slogan. It's a declaration of spiritual independence. Because freedom begins the moment you stop begging for it. And that is exactly what this new generation is learning. They are building apps, creating art, studying science, and defending their cultures, not as victims, but as visionaries. They see Traoré not as a savior, but as a symbol, proof that one man's courage can awaken a million others. He stands in a long line of African revolutionaries: Thomas Sankara, Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, and now Ibrahim Traoré, the captain who reminded Africa of its heartbeat. But let's not pretend the story is simple. Every symbol has shadows. Every hero has critics. Burkina Faso still struggles, economically, politically, militarily. The insurgency hasn't vanished overnight, and questions of democracy and human rights still linger. But perhaps before freedom can take shape, it must first find its soul. And that is what this movement represents, the reawakening of Africa's soul. It's not perfect, it's not polished, but it's powerful. Because power begins not with control, but with conviction. When Captain Traoré addressed the youth of Africa, he didn't speak from a palace. He spoke from a field. He said, "The only way we win is when we believe we can." And those words matter, because belief changes everything. Belief makes 90 kilometers possible. Belief makes liberation possible. And belief is contagious. From Burkina Faso to the streets of Nairobi, from the markets of Lagos to the universities of Accra, a question now echoes. What if Africa stopped asking to be saved and started saving itself? What if instead of exporting gold and importing poverty, it built its own prosperity? What if instead of waiting for aid, it created its own wealth? What if the next revolution isn't in the battlefield, but in the mind, in the classroom, in the courage to dream differently? That is the real meaning of the 90-kilometer rescue. Not just soldiers walking through danger, but a continent walking toward its destiny. Every step of that march represents something. The first 10 kilometers, courage. The next 20, sacrifice. The next 30, faith. The final 30, victory. 90 kilometers that symbolize hundreds of years of struggle. From colonial rule to independence, from division to unity. Each kilometer, a chapter in Africa's unfinished story. And that story is still being written. By young leaders, by farmers, by teachers, by artists, by dreamers. By anyone who dares to believe that Africa's future is not a gift, it's a right. The march continues, not just in Burkina Faso, but in every African heart that beats for change. Because the greatest rescue is not of land, it's of spirit. And that is why this story matters. Today, when you look at Ibrahim Traoré, you might see a soldier. But when you look closer, you see something else. You see a reflection of Africa itself. Bold, bruised, but unbroken. Young, defiant, determined. A continent that has been through centuries of storms and still refuses to sink. A people who have been told, "You can't," and still whisper, "Watch us." That's what the 90 kilometers stand for. Every kilometer a promise that Africa's journey is not over. The world may not understand it yet, but a quiet revolution is underway. One not fought with weapons, but with will. Not written in treaties, but in truth. And when future generations ask, when did Africa start to rise again? The answer might just be, it began the day a young captain walked 90 kilometers to rescue his people, and in doing so, rescued Africa's hope. So today, remember this: liberation is not given, it is taken. Freedom is not found, it is fought for. And courage is not born, it is chosen. Africa no longer waits for rescue. Africa is the rescue. If you're watching this and you feel the fire, share it. If you believe in this new Africa, speak it. If you are part of this generation, live it. Because every time an African refuses fear, every time an African builds instead of begs, every time an African stands tall, The 90 kilometers grow longer, louder, stronger. The march never stopped. It simply changed shape. And one day, when history looks back, it will not remember the fear. It will remember the footsteps of a continent that finally believed that it is the rescue. Africa, your story is not finished. Your march is not over, and your destiny has just begun.